Lieutenant Commander Zara Chen sat in the corner of the mess hall, her tray of synthetic protein barely touched as she stared out the viewport at the swirling nebula beyond. The USS Valiant cut through space like a knife through silk, its massive hull housing over 3,000 souls from a dozen different species. Yet despite being surrounded by so many beings, Zara felt utterly alone. She had always been the quiet one. Even back on Earth during her academy days, instructors would struggle to remember her name during roll call. While her classmates engaged in heated debates about military strategy or competed in combat simulations, Zara would sit silently, absorbing every word, every technique, every detail. Her scores were consistently above average, but never spectacular enough to draw attention. She graduated in the middle of her class, received her assignment to the Valiant without ceremony, and had spent the last 2 years blending into the background of ship life. "Hey, isn't that the girl from communications?" she heard someone whisper from a nearby table. A group of Altarian officers were gesturing in her direction, their crystalline features catching the artificial light. "I think so. Never heard her speak above a whisper," another replied with a dismissive wave of his elongated hand. Zara's fingers tightened around her fork, but her expression remained neutral. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked, treated as furniture by her fellow officers. The human contingent aboard the Valiant was small, only about 200 personnel, and most of them seemed to view her as the boring communications officer who processed routine transmissions and filed reports. What they didn't know was that Zara Chen had spent her entire life preparing for war. Born in the ruins of Neo-Singapore, she had grown up in the aftermath of the Terran Rebellion. Her parents had been part of the resistance movement that finally threw off the yoke of the corporate syndicate, and they had raised their daughter with stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when pushed to their limits. Her father, a former special operations soldier, had taught her to fight before she could properly tie her shoes. Her mother, a brilliant engineer, had shown her how to turn everyday objects into weapons. But Zara had learned early that being underestimated was its own kind of advantage. The mess hall's ambient lighting suddenly shifted to red, and the ship's announcement system crackled to life. Captain Voss's gruff voice echoed through the corridors, his Terran accent thick with tension. "All hands to battle stations. We have multiple hostile contacts approaching from the Kepler system. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The mess hall erupted into controlled chaos as officers and crew members rushed to their assigned positions. Zara calmly finished chewing her last bite of protein, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and stood up. While others ran past her in panic, she walked at a measured pace toward her duty station in the communications array. The corridors of the Valiant thrummed with activity as the ship's massive engines powered up to full combat readiness. Zara could feel the subtle vibrations through the deck plating as the artificial gravity generators adjusted to accommodate potential evasive maneuvers. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows on the walls, and the smell of ozone filled the air as energy weapons systems came online. She entered the communications center to find chaos. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the senior communications officer, was frantically trying to coordinate with the bridge while managing incoming distress calls from civilian vessels in the area. His hands shook as he worked the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. "Chen," he called out when he spotted her. "Thank God you're here. I need you to handle the civilian evacuation coordination while I maintain contact with Fleet Command." Zara nodded and slipped into her workstation with practiced efficiency. Her fingers danced across the holographic interface as she opened communication channels to the dozen civilian ships scattered throughout the system. Merchant vessels, passenger liners, and mining operations all screamed for assistance as enemy contacts closed in on their positions. "Civilian vessel Prosperity. This is USS Valiant Communications. Alter your heading to 07 Mark IV and increase to maximum burn. You have hostile contacts bearing down on your position." Her voice remained calm and steady despite the growing tension in the room. While Rodriguez shouted updates to the bridge and other technicians scrambled to maintain sensor links, Zara methodically guided each civilian ship toward safety. She calculated intercept courses in her head, predicted enemy movement patterns, and orchestrated an improvised evacuation that would have impressed a fleet admiral. The bridge communications crackled with updates from Captain Voss. All stations report readiness. Enemy fleet composition appears to be 12 hegemony cruisers and approximately 30 fighter craft. They're not responding to hails and are maintaining attack vectors. Zara's blood ran cold. The hegemony was a coalition of aggressive alien species that had been expanding their territory through conquest and subjugation. Their ships were heavily armed and their crews notoriously ruthless. What's more, they had a particular hatred for humans, viewing Terran ingenuity as a threat to their established order. "Rodriguez, we're losing contact with the mining station at coordinates 77 Alpha," called out Technician Morse from across the room. "Damn it," Rodriguez muttered, his hands shaking even more violently. "Chen, can you try to raise them? I'm getting interference on all my channels." Zara switched her attention to the mining station's frequency and immediately heard the problem. The interference wasn't random static. It was a deliberate jamming pattern designed to disrupt human communication protocols. She had studied hegemony tactics extensively during her free time, one of many subjects she had delved into while others socialized or relaxed. "The interference is artificial," she reported. "Hegemony jamming pattern Delta 7. I can compensate by rotating our transmission frequency every 12 seconds. Rodriguez looked at her with surprise. "How do you know they're jamming patterns?" "I studied them," Zara replied simply, her fingers already implementing the countermeasures. Within moments, clear communication with the mining station was re-established. As the first wave of enemy fighters entered the system, Zara found herself becoming the nerve center of the civilian evacuation. She guided damaged ships to safe harbor, coordinated rescue operations for vessels that couldn't escape on their own, and maintained constant communication with the fleet as battle was joined. The Valiant shuddered as enemy fire struck its shields, but the ship's massive defensive systems held firm. Through the communications array, Zara could hear the chatter of fighter pilots engaging the enemy, the calm reports of weapons officers, and the steady stream of orders from Captain Voss. "Communications. I need an update on civilian evacuation status," the captain's voice commanded. Rodriguez opened his mouth to respond, but Zara was already keying her microphone. "Captain, this is Communications Specialist Chen. Civilian evacuation is 73% complete. Remaining vessels are the mining station Forge Master, passenger liner Serenity, and merchant vessel Goldstream. The mining station is experiencing engine difficulties and requires assistance. The liner is carrying 4,000 passengers and needs an escort. The merchant vessel appears to be attempting to salvage cargo and is refusing to evacuate." There was a brief pause before the captain responded. "Acknowledged, Chen. Continue evacuation procedures. Rodriguez, coordinate with tactical on fighter escort assignments." As the battle intensified around them, Zara lost herself in the rhythm of crisis management. She had trained for moments like this her entire life, though she had never imagined it would be from a communications console rather than the front lines. Every decision carried weight. Every delay could mean lives lost. Every communication could be the difference between salvation and disaster. The hegemony fighters were pressing their attack with increasing desperation, suggesting they were either confident in their ability to overwhelm the human defenses or were operating under orders that left them no choice but victory or death. Zara suspected the latter, as hegemony military doctrine emphasized absolute commitment to objectives regardless of cost. "Chen, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the hegemony cruisers," Technician Morse called out. "Looks like they're powering up some kind of superweapon." Zara's hands froze over her controls. She had read intelligence reports about experimental hegemony weapons designed to crack planetary shields or destroy space stations. If they were preparing to deploy such a weapon, it could spell doom not just for the civilian vessels still evacuating, but for the Valiant itself. "Rodriguez, we need to warn the captain," she said, but when she turned toward the senior officer's station, she found him slumped over his console, unconscious. A piece of debris from a nearby explosion had struck him in the head, leaving a trail of blood down his face. Without hesitation, Zara activated the emergency medical beacon and took over Rodriguez's primary communication duties. She now controlled the primary link between the bridge and the rest of the ship, a responsibility that would normally require months of additional training and security clearance. "Bridge, this is communications. Be advised, Lieutenant Rodriguez is down with head trauma. I'm assuming primary communication duties. Also, sensor readings indicate the enemy is powering up what appears to be a capital ship weapon system." "Who is this?" came Captain Voss's sharp reply. "Communications Specialist Chen, sir." Another pause, longer this time. Zara could hear weapons fire and shouted orders in the background of the bridge communication. "Chen, can you maintain primary communications?" "Yes, sir." "Do it, and get me detailed analysis on that weapon system." As medical personnel arrived to treat Rodriguez, Zara found herself at the center of the ship's communication network during the most intense battle the Valiant had seen in years. She coordinated damage reports from engineering, relayed tactical information between the bridge and weapons control, and continued managing the civilian evacuation, all while analyzing the energy readings from the hegemony weapon. The weapon appeared to be some kind of focused particle beam designed to overload shield generators through harmonic resonance. If her calculations were correct, it could potentially breach the Valiant's shields with a single shot, leaving the ship vulnerable to conventional weapons fire. "Bridge, this is communications," she reported. "Analysis of the enemy weapon suggests it's designed to disrupt our shield harmonics. Recommend rotating shield frequency every 15 seconds to prevent resonance lock. Acknowledged. Tactical. Implement rotating shield frequencies per Chen's recommendation." The next few minutes became a blur of activity as Zara juggled multiple critical tasks simultaneously. She guided the last of the civilian ships to safety, while coordinating the ship's response to the hegemony weapon threat. When the enemy finally fired their superweapon, the rotating shield frequencies deflected most of the energy, though the ship still shook violently from the impact. "Excellent work, Chen," came the captain's voice over the communication system. "Your analysis saved the ship." But Zara barely heard the praise. Her attention was focused on a new problem developing in the sensor readings. A second wave of hegemony ships was approaching from the outer system, and these vessels were significantly larger than the first wave. Worse, they appeared to be moving to cut off the escape routes she had been using to evacuate the civilian vessels. As she watched the tactical display, Zara realized with growing horror that the first wave of attackers had been nothing more than a distraction. The real assault was just beginning, and this time, the hegemony wasn't just trying to destroy human ships. They were positioning themselves to capture prisoners and technology. The quiet communications specialist who had been ignored and overlooked for 2 years suddenly found herself holding the lives of thousands in her hands. And as the second wave of enemy ships closed in, she realized that everything she had learned, every skill she had developed in the shadows, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The second wave of hegemony vessels emerged from hyperspace like predators materializing from shadow. Zara's console erupted with new contacts as sensors struggled to track the incoming fleet. 12 massive dreadnoughts, each one dwarfing the cruisers from the first wave, accompanied by what appeared to be an entire carrier group of fighter craft and support vessels. "Jesus Christ," whispered Technician Morse as the tactical display updated. "There must be 200 ships out there." Zara's mind raced as she analyzed the enemy formation. The positioning was too precise to be coincidental. The hegemony had planned this operation meticulously, using the first wave to probe human defenses while positioning the main fleet to exploit weaknesses. What concerned her most was the way they were spreading out to surround the Valiant, rather than focusing on a direct assault. "Bridge, this is communications," she reported. "Enemy fleet is deploying in a capture formation rather than a destruction pattern. I believe they intend to board us." Captain Voss's voice carried a new edge of tension. "Chen, are you certain of that assessment?" "Yes, sir. The formation matches hegemony boarding protocols from the intelligence briefings. They're positioning to disable rather than destroy." The implications hit everyone on the bridge simultaneously. Being captured by the hegemony was considered a fate worse than death. Their prison camps were notorious for brutal experimentation and psychological torture, particularly when human prisoners were involved. The aliens viewed human adaptability and ingenuity as dangerous traits that needed to be studied and ultimately eliminated. "All hands, this is the captain," Voss announced over the ship's communications system. "We are facing overwhelming odds against an enemy force that intends to capture rather than destroy this vessel. I will not allow any member of this crew to fall into hegemony hands. All personnel are authorized to use any means necessary to prevent capture. Command protocols are suspended. All department heads report to me immediately." Zara felt a chill run down her spine. Suspended command protocols meant that officers were authorized to take extreme measures, up to and including the destruction of the ship itself, to prevent capture. The captain was preparing for a last stand. Around her, the communications center had become a hive of frantic activity. With Rodriguez still unconscious in the medical bay, Zara found herself effectively in charge of all ship communications during the crisis. Technicians looked to her for orders, and she found herself coordinating not just with the bridge, but with every department on the ship. "Chen, I'm getting reports of internal communication failures on decks 7 through 12, reported Technician Kim. "Something's jamming our internal networks." Zara's blood ran cold. Internal jamming could only mean one thing. The hegemony had already managed to get infiltration units aboard the ship, or they were using some kind of advanced electronic warfare system to disrupt human technology from the inside out. "Switch to hardline communications for those decks," she ordered, "and initiate lockdown protocols for all sensitive areas. We may have been infiltrated." As Kim worked to implement her orders, Zara opened a direct channel to the bridge. "Captain, we're experiencing internal communication failures. Possible infiltration in progress." "Confirmed, Chen. Security is reporting strange readings from the lower decks. Can you maintain communication with all departments?" "Yes, sir. But we'll need to use backup systems. Primary networks are compromised." What happened next would be talked about in fleet communications schools for decades to come. Working with equipment that was operating at barely 50% efficiency due to enemy jamming and infiltration attempts, Zara somehow managed to maintain communication links with every department on the ship. She rerouted data through backup channels, created redundant communication networks, and even improvised new protocols on the fly to keep information flowing. But her greatest challenge was yet to come. "Communications, this is engineering," came Chief Patterson's gruff voice over the hard line. "We've got a big problem down here. The infiltrators aren't just jamming our systems, they're physically sabotaging critical components. Main power is down to 60% and falling. At this rate, we'll lose life support within the hour." Zara stared at her displays in growing horror. The hegemony infiltrators were systematically destroying the ship's ability to sustain life, forcing the crew into an impossible choice between surrender and death. It was a brutally effective tactic that played on human compassion and the instinct for survival. "Captain," she reported, "Engineering is reporting systematic sabotage of life support systems. The infiltrators are trying to force our surrender by making the ship uninhabitable." "How long do we have?" Chief Patterson estimates 1 hour before life support fails completely. There was a long pause before the captain responded. All hands. This is Captain Voss. Enemy infiltrators have sabotaged our life support systems. We have 1 hour to eliminate the threat or abandon ship. I want every available person hunting these bastards down. Security teams, arm yourselves with whatever you can find. This is now a hunt. As security teams mobilized throughout the ship, Zara found herself coordinating a desperate search and destroy mission while simultaneously managing the ongoing space battle and maintaining communication with the scattered departments. The Valiant shuddered continuously under enemy fire as the hegemony fleet closed in, testing the ship's defenses and looking for weaknesses. "Chen, I'm losing contact with Security Team Alpha," reported Technician Park. "They were investigating the engineering sub-level when their signals just vanished." Zara quickly analyzed the ship's internal sensor network and found dead zones throughout the lower decks where monitoring equipment had been systematically destroyed. The infiltrators were moving through the ship like ghosts, staying ahead of the security teams and continuing their sabotage operations. "Patch me through to Chief Patterson," she ordered. "Chen, thank God," came the chief engineer's voice. "We just lost another power coupling. These things are tearing through our systems faster than we can repair them." "Chief, can you seal off the compromised sections and reroute power through alternate pathways?" "Maybe, but I'd need to shut down non-essential systems. That means no artificial gravity on half the ship, reduced lighting, and minimal life support." Zara made a split-second decision that would affect the lives of 3,000 people. "Do it, Chief. Seal off the compromised sections and implement emergency protocols. We'll adapt." As the ship's power grid reconfigured itself around the damaged sections, Zara felt the artificial gravity fluctuate beneath her feet. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows throughout the communications center as non-essential systems powered down one by one. The temperature began to drop as environmental systems scaled back to minimum settings, but her gamble paid off. Without power flowing to the compromised sections, the hegemony infiltrators found themselves trapped in areas with no life support and no way to continue their sabotage. Security teams, now equipped with environmental suits, could move through the sealed sections and hunt down the intruders. "Security Team Beta to communications," came a breathless voice over the hard line. "We've cornered 3 infiltrators in Engineering Section C. These things aren't like anything I've ever seen before." Zara frowned. "Can you elaborate, Beta?" "They look like they're part machine, part biological, some kind of hybrid technology, and Chen, they're wearing human faces." The implications hit Zara like a physical blow. The hegemony had developed shape-shifting infiltrators that could mimic human appearance. That meant there could be more of them throughout the ship, blending in with the crew and continuing their mission of sabotage and intelligence gathering. "All personnel, this is communications," she announced over the ship-wide system. "Be advised, enemy infiltrators are using advanced camouflage technology to mimic human appearance. Institute verification protocols immediately. No one acts alone from this point forward." As paranoia began to spread through the ship, Zara realized that the hegemony had achieved something almost as devastating as direct conquest. They had turned the crew against themselves. Trust was breaking down as people began to eye their colleagues with suspicion, wondering who might be an enemy in disguise. The space battle outside was reaching a crescendo as the hegemony fleet pressed their attack. The Valiant's shields were holding, but barely, and weapon systems were beginning to show signs of stress from sustained combat. Enemy fighters swarmed around the ship like angry insects, probing for weaknesses and testing response times. "Bridge to communications," came Captain Voss's voice. "Chen, I need a miracle. Can you find us a way out of this?" Zara stared at her tactical display, studying the positions of enemy ships and the layout of the system. The hegemony fleet had them surrounded, but their formation was designed for capture rather than destruction. That meant there were gaps in their coverage, small windows of opportunity that a desperate ship might be able to exploit. "Captain, there's a narrow corridor between the 3rd and 4th enemy battle groups. If we could punch through there at maximum burn, we might reach the hyperspace jump point before they can react." "What about the civilian ships still in the area?" Zara's heart sank. In her focus on finding an escape route, she had forgotten about the handful of civilian vessels that were still struggling to clear the system. They would never be able to keep up with a high-speed run to the jump point, and abandoning them would mean leaving hundreds of innocent people to face the hegemony alone. "The civilians won't be able to match our speed," she admitted. "Then we don't run," the captain said with finality. "We find another way." As if responding to his words, the ship's sensors detected a new development in the enemy fleet. The largest of the hegemony dreadnoughts was powering up what appeared to be a massive tractor beam system. If they managed to lock onto the Valiant with that device, escape would become impossible. "Captain, the flagship is preparing to engage a tractor beam. Once they have us locked, we won't be able to maneuver." "Time to tractor beam activation?" Zara quickly analyzed the energy readings. Approximately 8 minutes to full power. 8 minutes to find a solution that would save the ship, the crew, and the remaining civilians. 8 minutes to turn a hopeless situation into a fighting chance. As Zara stared at her displays, her mind raced through everything she had learned during her years of study and preparation. And then, as if a switch had been thrown in her mind, the pieces began to fall into place. The hegemony formation, their capture priorities, their own technology. It all combined into a desperate plan that just might work. But it would require her to do something she had never done before. Step out of the shadows and take command of a situation that was spinning rapidly out of control. The quiet communications specialist was about to become the most important person on the ship. Zara's fingers flew across her control console as the desperate plan formed in her mind. She had noticed something in the hegemony fleet formation that everyone else had missed. A fatal flaw in their positioning that could be exploited if she could coordinate multiple actions simultaneously across different ship systems. "Captain," she said, opening a direct channel to the bridge, "I have an idea. But it's going to require precise timing and cooperation from every department on the ship." "I'm listening, Chen." "The hegemony tractor beam system requires them to maintain a stable formation to focus the beam effectively. If we can create enough chaos in their fleet formation, we might be able to break their lock and create an escape window. But we'll need to coordinate a simultaneous attack on multiple fronts." There was a pause before the captain responded. "Explain." Zara took a deep breath. Everything she was about to suggest went against standard fleet protocol, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "First, we use our remaining fighter squadrons to target the formation-keeping ships rather than the big dreadnoughts. If we can disrupt their positioning even slightly, their tractor beam will lose focus. Second, we overload our own shield generators to create a massive electromagnetic pulse that will interfere with their targeting systems. Third, we use the explosion as cover to launch every escape pod we have, not to evacuate, but to create false targets that will confuse their sensors. Chen, overloading the shield generators could destroy the ship." "Not if we time it right, sir. The pulse will only last about 30 seconds, but it should be enough to blind their sensors and give us a window to move." Captain Voss was quiet for several moments. Zara could hear the sounds of battle in the background, weapons fire, shouted orders, the constant hum of stressed ship systems. Finally, his voice came back over the communication. "How confident are you in this plan?" "Honestly, sir, about 60% chance of success. But our current odds are essentially 0, so 60% looks pretty good from where I'm sitting." Another pause. Then, "Do it. Chen, you're now acting as tactical coordinator for this operation. All department heads will report to you for timing instructions." Zara felt her heart skip a beat. Acting tactical coordinator meant she was effectively running the battle plan for a ship with 3,000 souls aboard. The quiet communications specialist who had been invisible for 2 years was now responsible for their survival. Acknowledged, sir. All departments. This is Communications Specialist Chen acting as tactical coordinator. I need immediate status reports from Fighter Command, Engineering, Weapons, and Navigation. Over the next few minutes, Zara found herself coordinating the most complex battle maneuver the Valiant had ever attempted. She had to time fighter launches to coincide with shield overload sequences, coordinate escape pod deployments to maximize sensor confusion, and calculate navigation vectors that would take advantage of the brief window when enemy targeting systems would be disrupted. "Fighter Command to Tactical," came Commander Hayes' voice. "All available fighters are ready for launch. We're down to 8 operational craft, but they're armed and ready." "Engineering to Tactical," reported Chief Patterson. "Shield generators are at maximum output. I can give you exactly 43 seconds of overload before we risk permanent damage." "Weapons to Tactical. All missile batteries loaded and ready. We've got enough firepower for 1 massive salvo." "Navigation to Tactical. Escape vectors calculated and ready to implement on your command." Zara studied her tactical display one more time, watching the hegemony ships closing in like the jaws of a trap. The massive dreadnought in the center of their formation was almost ready to engage its tractor beam, and once that happened, the Valiant would be helpless. "All stations, this is Tactical. On my mark, we execute Operation Chaos. Mark in 5, 4, 3, 2, mark." The next 40 seconds became the most intense moments in the recorded history of human space combat. The Valiant's 8 remaining fighters launched simultaneously, screaming away from the ship in carefully calculated attack vectors designed to force the hegemony formation ships to break position. Rather than targeting the heavily armored dreadnoughts, they went after the smaller support vessels that were maintaining the fleet's precise positioning. At exactly the same moment, every missile battery on the Valiant fired at once, sending a wall of explosives toward the enemy fleet. The missiles weren't intended to cause significant damage to the heavily shielded hegemony ships, but rather to force them to activate their defensive systems and further disrupt their formation. Chief Patterson initiated the shield generator overload exactly on schedule. The Valiant's defensive shields flared to brilliant life, consuming every erg of power the ship could generate before exploding outward in a massive electromagnetic pulse that washed over both fleets like an invisible tsunami. And in the chaos that followed, over 200 escape pods launched from the Valiant in every direction, creating dozens of false targets that confused enemy sensors already struggling to cope with electromagnetic interference. The plan worked better than Zara had dared hope. The hegemony fleet formation collapsed as support ships were forced to take evasive action. The massive dreadnought's tractor beam lost its target lock as sensor systems overloaded. Fighter craft found themselves flying blind as navigation systems rebooted after the electromagnetic pulse. "Now!" Zara shouted over the communication system. "All ahead, flank speed! Emergency burn to the jump point!" The Valiant's massive engines roared to life, pushing the ship forward at accelerations that strained the inertial dampeners to their limits. The ship shot through the gap in the enemy formation like a bullet, racing toward the hyperspace jump point while chaos reigned among the hegemony fleet. But Zara's attention wasn't on their escape. She was focused on her communication console, where she was coordinating the recovery of their fighter squadrons and monitoring the status of the civilian ships they couldn't abandon. "Fighter Command, this is Tactical. Status report on recovery operations. 7 fighters recovered successfully. Lieutenant Morrison's fighter took heavy damage, but he's aboard and alive. Civilian ships, this is USS Valiant. We are beginning emergency evacuation procedures. Prepare to abandon your vessels immediately." Working with a speed and efficiency that amazed the bridge crew, Zara coordinated the emergency evacuation of 4 civilian ships while simultaneously managing the Valiant's escape from the hegemony fleet. Tractor beams pulled small evacuation craft aboard while the ship continued its desperate run toward the jump point. The electromagnetic pulse had bought them precious time, but it was rapidly running out. Hegemony ships were already beginning to reform their pursuit formation, and their superior speed meant they would catch the Valiant before it could reach safety, unless Zara could pull off one more miracle. "Captain, I need permission to access the ship's experimental systems," she said. "What experimental systems?" "The prototype quantum communication array in Cargo Bay 7. It's designed for instantaneous communication across galactic distances. But I think I can modify it to send a distress signal that will reach the nearest fleet units immediately." "Chen, that system is classified beyond your clearance level." "Sir, with respect, we're about to die. Clearance levels don't matter if there's no one left alive to court-martial me." Another pause. Then, "Do it." Zara's fingers danced across her console as she accessed systems she wasn't supposed to know existed. The quantum communication array was indeed beyond her official clearance, but during her 2 years of studying every technical manual she could find, she had memorized its specifications and operation procedures. The array required enormous amounts of power to function, power the ship could barely spare, but by rerouting energy from non-essential systems and temporarily borrowing power from the weapons arrays, she managed to bring the experimental system online. "Mayday, Mayday, this is USS Valiant transmitting on quantum emergency frequency. We are under attack by superior hegemony forces at coordinates 77 Alpha 9 Delta. Request immediate assistance. We have successfully rescued over 4,000 civilian personnel and are carrying critical intelligence about hegemony infiltration technology." The quantum signal burst across space faster than light itself, reaching Fleet Command in seconds rather than the hours it would take for a normal subspace transmission. And because it was transmitted on quantum frequencies, the hegemony couldn't jam or intercept it. "Signal transmitted successfully," Zara reported. "Fleet response, incoming now." Her console erupted with confirmation signals as 3 fleet battle groups that had been conducting exercises in nearby systems immediately altered course to respond to the Valiant's distress call. The nearest ships would arrive within 20 minutes, but 20 minutes was longer than they had. The hegemony pursuit fleet was closing rapidly, and their lead ships would be within weapons range long before help arrived. "Captain," Zara said quietly, "the pursuing fleet will overtake us in approximately 12 minutes. Fleet assistance will arrive in 19 minutes minimum. So we hold out for 7 minutes against impossible odds." "Yes, sir." Captain Voss's voice carried a note of grim determination when he spoke to the crew. "All hands, this is the captain. Fleet assistance is en route. But we need to survive the next 7 minutes on our own. Every person on this ship has proven themselves today. Now let's prove ourselves one more time." As the hegemony ships closed for their final attack, Zara found herself coordinating the defense of a damaged ship with degraded systems against overwhelming odds. But something had changed in the way the crew responded to her orders. The quiet communications specialist, who had been ignored for 2 years, was now giving commands that could mean the difference between life and death, and everyone aboard trusted her completely. The next 7 minutes felt like hours. Enemy fire pounded the Valiant's weakened shields, while Zara coordinated damage control, managed power distribution, and somehow kept the ship's critical systems functioning through pure determination and an encyclopedic knowledge of backup procedures. When the first fleet ships finally emerged from hyperspace, their weapons blazing as they engaged the hegemony fleet, Zara allowed herself to slump back in her chair for the first time in hours. "Tactical coordination to bridge," she reported with exhausted satisfaction. "Fleet units have engaged the enemy. We are no longer in immediate danger." "Outstanding work, Chen." I'm recommending you for immediate promotion and a commendation for exceptional service under fire." As the battle shifted in humanity's favor, and the Valiant limped toward safety, Zara looked around the communications center at the faces of her colleagues. They were looking at her with something she had never seen before: respect, admiration, and not a small amount of awe. The quiet girl that no one had paid attention to had just saved everyone aboard the ship. But more importantly, she had proven that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the human arsenal wasn't advanced technology or superior firepower. It was the unassuming person in the corner who had been preparing for their moment to shine. 3 months later, the combat recording from that day would become required viewing at the Fleet Academy. Students would study how communications specialist Chen had turned a hopeless situation into a victory through quick thinking, detailed knowledge, and the kind of calm competence that only came from years of preparation. But Zara Chen, now Lieutenant Chen and the youngest communications officer to ever receive the Medal of Heroic Achievement, still preferred to sit in the corner of the mess hall. The only difference was that now, when people whispered about her, they did so with respect. And sometimes, late at night when the ship was quiet, she would smile to herself, knowing that the hegemony had learned a valuable lesson that day. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They're usually the ones who have been paying the closest attention.